In watercolor painting, your brushes are your most important tool. So in this video, I'm going to show you the brushes that I like best and why, how to use them, how to hold them when you're painting. I'll show you some different brush strokes, and I'll show you even how to clean your brushes. So let's get started. And I want to start with just the brushes themselves. This is an example of a wonderful sable brush. Both of these are. They're much more expensive. They're natural hair. They come from the sable mink, the tip of its tail. These are a lot more expensive, but they're the best quality brushes you can use. There's also synthetic brushes where the hair is made from synthetic, and they're less expensive, but they work really well, and they are actually even a little bit more durable. The sable brushes are the best ones you can use. These are called rounds, and they come to a nice point. This is an example of a half round, and this is an example of a flat, which is just what it sounds like. It has a flat section of hair in it. This is a rigger, also known as a script, something I use for smaller details. These are Isabey brushes, wonderful to use with, or to paint with. They're what Matisse favored. Now these Isabey brushes are more like a mop, and so you shouldn't use those when you're first learning to paint in watercolor. Wait till you've painted for a while, because they're a little more difficult to use, but once you get used to them, they're a lot more fun to use and very rewarding. Now this is an example of a little tiny brush. My suggestion on what to do with these is just throw them away. They're of no value. You're better off using a bigger brush, even for detail, because a good big brush will have a nice point on it, and you can do all the fine work you want. And if you're doing detail work, just put the tip of the brush in the water and paint, and it'll be easier to control. One thing that's really important is to keep your colors moist. I live in Denver, Colorado, where it's very dry, so I'm constantly spraying the colors. And before I start painting, I open my palette and spray the colors about 20 minutes before I start painting, so they really are nice and moist. If you have to scrub on the color to get enough paint out, then they're certainly not moist. And I'm going to be using a number 10 sable brush for this exercise. And I want to show you something that has been really valuable for me. And it's just a technique that I call point press and lift. And it's where you put the point of the brush down, move it a little bit, and then lift. Just like that. And you can practice different strokes with this, even turning the brush. But when I paint like this through different parts of the composition, it helps me keep in a nice rhythm. It keeps me from moving too fast or too slow. And it's just that simple point, press, and lift that's been really helpful to me. Now, as far as the brush itself, all watercolor brushes have a balance to them. And so you should move it around in your hand like this until you find where there's a really nice balance to it. And that's the way you should hold your brush. And don't hold it like a pencil where you're way down like this, like you're printing or writing script with it. Hold it back in that sweet spot so there's a nice balance to it. And use your arm to move around. And if you want to do finer detail, I use my little finger like this to balance with. Just put that little finger on the watercolor paper and then use the brush, and it really is a nice balance, and that way you don't have your hand dragging through the painting all the time. Another thing that's very helpful is you want to always remember to move the brush the way the handle of the brush, this back here, move it in a direction that is pointed. For example, just like this. or like this, always moving in the direction that the handle of the brush is pointed. The reason for that is the watercolor paper has a texture to it. It's almost like a little version of sandpaper. So you'll really save your brushes and keep them in good working order if you always move the brush the way the handle is pointed. If you move it back and forth like this, it's like scrubbing the brush across sandpaper, and it'll really tear your brushes up, and they won't last as long, and they'll wear out faster. Another thing that's important is always use the biggest brush you can for whatever section of the painting you're working on. Don't get in the habit of using small brushes, little tiny brushes. It'll just make the painting look overworked and fussy. And bigger brushes have a nicer balance to them, and they're a lot more fun to use. I want to go through some of the techniques now that watercolorists use with their brushes. And one of the first ones I want to show you is called dry brush. So I'm just getting a nice bit of paint and water on my brush. Now this is a 140-pound cold press watercolor paper, so it has some nice texture to it. And this is what I mean by dry brush. See how the brush skips along like this? It shows the texture in the paper. That's a nice dry brush stroke right there. And if you think of something like a sandy road or gravel or a weathered barn or an old log, something like that, where you'd want that kind of texture, it's really a valuable thing, and it's very it's something that basically just watercolorists use, and it's one of the wonderful techniques that you can do with watercolor. Another one is, and I'm going to do this on the same sheet of paper, it's called spattering. And so I'm really going to load my brush up with paint and water, and what you do is you smack the brush against something like this, and it spatters paint all over it like that. Now any area that you don't want covered with spattering, you have to cover it like this. So I just took a paper towel with a hole in it like that, and I can move that around to whatever area I want the spattering like this, and where I don't want it, it gets captured by the paper towel. So there's a good example of the spattering like that. Now one of the things I do after spattering, I go through and just delicately move the brush around so some of these spatterings are connected like that. They'll fit into the painting a little bit better. You can also use your fingertip like that to go through it. I try to get different values in the spattering. Some of them I lift out a little bit, other ones I leave just the way they are. So that's another valuable technique for watercolor painters. This is what I was talking about, how you can use just the tip of the brush if you have a good brush with a nice point on it. This is a number 10, which is a fairly large brush, and I can do detail work like that. I can even wring out a little bit more of the paint and make some finer marks and strokes like this. You can really get all the little detail you want, even with a bigger brush. It just takes some practice, but it's very rewarding, and you will enjoy painting a lot more if you work on using the biggest brush you can for each part of the painting. Another thing I want to cover is how to take care of your brushes. Don't leave them soaking in water like this for very long, because it'll bend the tip and it can make a permanent bend in it, which can be really annoying. Now, always clean your brushes, obviously, between each color. And then I want to show you how to clean a brush when you're done painting. I don't do this every time I'm painting, but I do it, every couple months at least. I have just some ordinary dish soap in my hand, and the brush is really wet. And I'm just stirring it around in the palm of my hand like this. Your palm of your hand makes a perfect shape. And it gives you a chance to get all that gunk and dried up paint and everything else that turns up in there like that. Give it a good scrubbing and then rinse it out. Do it again just for a couple seconds and then rinse it out for good and get it really nice and clean that way. And that will help you take care of your brushes, and if you do that on occasion, they will last a long time and your investment will be worth the money. The painting we're going to look at is Side Canal, Venice. It was painted on location in Venice, Italy, and it's 8 by 10 inches. It was painted on Fabriano watercolor paper with sable brushes, Winsor Newton paints. The brush was actually a number 7. So we're going to look at how the brush strokes are visible in the painting and what they add to the painting. So let's take a look. This is an example of one of my paintings that has visible brushwork in it. It's a painting of Venice, and you can see here in the water reflections that they're visible brush strokes, and to me that adds a nice rhythm to the painting. And you can see it also up here in the buildings as well. And this is just an example of how leaving the brushwork visible in a painting can make it that much more interesting. Okay, so in conclusion, practice the exercises that I've talked about. Use visible brushstrokes in your painting. I think you'll like the results. And this is Dennis Pendleton saying, keep on painting.